You're listening to Pop, the History Makers, with me, Steve Blame. Annie Zaleski, welcome. This is a pleasure because we're here to talk about your latest book, Lady Gaga, Applause. Now, you're an award-winning writer, have written for Rolling Stone, The Guardian, Time, Billboard, amongst many others. You wrote the liner notes to the 2016 reissue of R.E.M's Out of Time, and also to Game Theory's 2020 collection Across the Barrier of Sound Postscript. Now, your last book was on Duran's Rio, 33 and a Third. And as I said, we're going to talk about Lady Gaga, Applause, in a little while, but I want to start with you and just ask you, what sort of music were you brought up around? What sort of music did your parents play?
It's a great question. That's a really good question. My parents grew up in the 60s and, my mom saw the Beatles on their first US tour. So it was definitely a steady diet of Beatles, Beach Boys, Simon and Garfunkel, Queen, classic rock. My dad also really liked early new wave. And so he liked the Cars and the Pretenders and Toto and things like that. And so it was kind of a mix of, the rock and roll from the US and the UK all kind of mashed up into one.
So when did your tastes start to differ and diverge, and what was the first record that you bought?
So it's funny, I think like most kids, when I became a teenager is when I finally started, because I would listen to all my parents' records. And so even as a teenager, that was, part of my musical diet. But then, when I started getting some money, started getting an allowance, weirdly enough, the first CD I ever got was Sloan's debut record, the Canadian band Sloan Smeared. I won it at school. Which was like the coolest first record ever. But I started buying, R.E.M. I joined the Columbia House Music Club. And so I got, 11 CDs for a penny. And so I got, R.E.M., Genesis. I'm sure there was some Smiths records in there too. It was kind of, I started kind of, exploring what was going on at the time, popular music wise in the 90s.
I mean, I'm of that older generation, that the first generation that was in love with Bowie. So when I was 13, it was 1972, so I'm a teenager in that era. And obviously I love Bowie's music, but he represented more than just music. He represented a place. As a gay man, he was a place where I belonged, in a way. Do you see what I mean? And in that era I felt very uncomfortable. Was there an artist where you had a sense of belonging, and what was that sense of belonging, if there was?
It's funny, Juliana Hatfield, who was in the Blake Babies, and then who's still a solo record artist to this day, she put out a record that's actually being reissued, the Juliana Hatfield 3, Become What You Are. And that record, she would talk about basically feeling insecure, feeling like she didn't fit in anywhere, that she kind of wanted to be left alone and just feeling kind of alienated. And I love that record, and I think like many teenagers, that those are very familiar feelings, but especially that record, there was something about just her maybe not feeling comfortable in her skin that I really resonated with. And so that record, more than anything, I remember from being a teenager, that just really made me feel seen, I guess, as the kids might say.
Yeah, how much currency or weight did your parents put on the idea of a cultural life?
They always encouraged me. I feel very grateful because, I was always into writing and I was always into music, and they always, maybe because they grew up, loving music and going to concerts, and they always encouraged me. My dad waited in line to buy concert tickets for me for an R.E.M. tour because, I wasn't allowed to skip school. So he went to the grocery store, and before, you could buy tickets online, and he bought me tickets, and I as an adult, I look back on that and I was like, wow, that's really wonderful. He took time out of his workday to do that for me because he knew it meant so much to me. And, that's really stuck with me and informed my life.
How did you become a writer?
I've always been a writer, I think. And I remember going back in second grade, I remember we had an assignment to write a story in a paragraph. And I instead gave the teacher 4 paragraphs because I had so much to say. And I was, 8, 9 years old. And I think, and from that point, that's always been just part of my life. In junior high, I was on the newspaper. In high school, I was on our newspaper. I was always writing terrible poetry on the side. I was never the best poet or never the best fiction writer, but I tried. So it's always been something that's brought me joy. And that's something that's I've always liked, because it's like a puzzle. When you're trying to describe something and trying to write something, it's trying to figure out what makes sense, what's new and interesting to say, and something that just, sparks joy, I guess.
A little bit about Cleveland, because you live in Cleveland, I think.
Correct.
Were you born in Cleveland?
I was, and then
okay.
I around a little.
Tell me a little bit about the music. I mean, Cleveland is, the where you get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. What is the musical history of Cleveland?
It's a lot of people wonder why the Rock Hall is in Cleveland, which would be a fair question, actually. It's always been this very interesting city where people have said that if you can make it in Cleveland, you can make it anywhere. Bowie broke out in Cleveland and Roxy Music, and you would never think in the middle of the Midwest, this very industrial city, but there's just something about, they're all music fans here. And, to the point where Elvis Presley played his first show above the Mason-Dixon line in Cleveland. We had DJs here. The first rock concert was in Cleveland. There's always been that kind of, maybe because the bar is lower, it's not New York, it's not LA, there's not a lot of attention. You can try things out. So they have this amazing, in the 70s, they had all these amazing punk and proto-punk bands. In the 80s, there were these kind of weirdo indie bands. In the 90s and in the current day, there's some interesting hip hop artists. There's always just something going on and someone making a difference. And it's funny because they're not always the most vocal about it. It's one of those things where you just kind of do what you do and you're making a difference, and you maybe aren't as vocal about it or trying to get as much attention, because, if you're from the Midwest, you try to, you get too big for your britches, they're going to cut you down. But there's always something cool. There's a rich history and people value that history.
You mentioned the first rock and roll concert, but wasn't there a riot? And
Yes.
Also, didn't the Beatles get banned from Cleveland?
It's funny. I feel like that was a little bit overblown. I know that their 66 concert, like many of their concerts on the tour, did not last very long. The Monkees, I believe, had a riot here too. It was the Monkees were here, and it was a lot. Going through the newspaper archives from Cleveland is amazing and fascinating, because there's all sorts of weird stories that'll make you turn your head.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, let's get on to Lady Gaga. Applause. Why did you decide to write a book about Lady Gaga?
The publisher approached me and I was immediately all in. I had been a Gaga fan since her very, very first record, very early days. I went to the tour where she opened for New Kids on the Block, and I showed up late. I always kicked myself, but I got to see her later tours, basically, after that. I just think she's one of the most fascinating, innovative, experimental pop artists out there. She treats pop music more like art, and very much like Bowie in terms of, she treats her career kind of like an art project, but the music is good, and there's always, it's at the core, there are wonderful songs behind everything. And so I just, I've always been a fan of her music, and I just have so much respect for her, and I just love her.
So the publisher basically came to you and said, would you like to write a book about Lady Gaga? And then, of course, you have to work on a premise and an idea. So what idea did you decide to come up with for this book?
The idea that made the most sense was kind of, because it was meant to be a biography, was to kind of go chronologically, just because, especially as an artist, you have to set the stage for how she even became Gaga, because obviously she didn't come out fully formed as this, flamboyant, fashionable person. She played shows in New York. She really kind of spent a lot of time trying to find her voice. So basically it made sense to chronologically start off with her, how she got her start, how she became Gaga, and how she's evolved. Because I mean, she's only been in the music business, I guess professionally, almost 15 years, but she's packed so much into it. It's unbelievable.
I mean, you've got the tag Lady Gaga applause.
Yes.
Applause, obviously the name of a track of art pop, but why did you choose that particular word? Why did you want to choose that word?
I mean, it's such an interesting concept, because she said, because it plays on fame almost, because obviously in a lot of her music she toys with what fame means, and the downside and the upside, and maybe a little stereotypical about it, and kind of lampooning fame. And applause, I think there's a lot of, obviously when she's performing, she's looking for genuine applause. But there's also, when you're applauding someone, you're giving them attention. You're acknowledging what they're doing. You're acknowledging, something they've done is good. And so it's kind of a multifaceted word as well, because I think that goes into what her career is. Obviously, we're lauding her and saying, her music is wonderful, but at the same time, like, she doesn't necessarily need the applause, because she's not necessarily doing it for fame, but yet it's welcome. So it's kind of a deeper word than maybe you might think on the surface.
Is there always something new that you can actually say about an artist?
There is. And that's what was so interesting, is digging in and doing research on her, because obviously I knew her story. I've written about her for years now. So I knew kind of the basics, but when I really dug into reading her interviews, watching, her music videos, watching her documentaries, it was really, there was so much more nuance and so much more depth than I think a lot of people might realize, because I think to many people, she's still this kind of, she's just quirky pop star who wears ridiculous outfits. A lot of people don't like her stuff with Tony Bennett. They think, oh, whatever, if she's doing jazz, boring. But there's so much more to her. And there was so much more sincerity, and I think genuine intent behind everything she does. And that really impressed me. And that really kind of informed how I was writing. And I saw so much more of her art and her music in new ways through that lens.
What is your work ethic as a writer?
That's a big question.
I'm a screenwriter, you see, exactly. So I need to know that.
Oh, my editors might not want to listen. I do best with a deadline, I think, as with most writers. So, I don't write in a linear fashion. I don't necessarily sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write something at the beginning and keep going. I kind of write and jump around when I'm doing a longer project like this, just because maybe today I'm more interested in writing this section of something. And then, well, maybe that'll spark something else 5 pages down the line. And so I basically have a big old document open and I kind of jump around, and, if I see something, I might put something here and slot it in, and then it all just kind of comes together. And then after I kind of have a draft down, I'll go back and read it and edit it myself and say, okay, I could say this better. This sounds clunky. Let's fix this. And so self-editing is also a really big part of my process. But I do research too, and I have documents open with links and reading things. And so it's a whole process.
Who did you interview, or did you interview anyone for this book? Because it seems like it's a lot of massive amount of research. Yeah. And because it's biographical, it's really sort of piecing the pieces together. So did you actually interview any new people for this book?
I didn't, just because there is so much out there. And, Gaga is the type of person that she doesn't do a lot of press these days because she doesn't need to. She's reached that echelon of pop stardom where she can just kind of focus on her art and her business and her philanthropy, and she doesn't necessarily have to sit for interviews like this. And then, she's just been documented so much over the years, and her collaborators have said things. And, I didn't necessarily think that I wasn't sure I'd get anything new. And so I opted not to interview anyone.
So what are the specific challenges of writing a book that sort of covers the whole life up to now of an artist?
I mean, part of it is deciding what to include and what not to include. I mean, I think that's with any piece, but especially with someone's life, just because especially with her, she was doing, something every day in certain years. And so you can't necessarily give a day-by-day chronicle of here's where they were. So you have to figure out what's most important and what's most interesting. And then also what kind of contributes to a narrative, and that's, you don't want it to read like a Wikipedia entry. You have to have some also analysis in there as well. So you kind of have to balance between, okay, we have this fact and let's maybe do some analysis here, or this needs a segue to get to this other point and things like that. And so, just trying to make sure that everything made sense and, flowed well, I think is the biggest challenge, because I knew she was busy, but I did not realize how busy until you really kind of dig in and focus on what she's been doing.
Well, that's why I mentioned your work ethic, because Gaga's work ethic is incredible, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's when you look at, I don't know how she, has enough hours in the day between her, acting career and doing music and then going to events and fashion. I mean, it's really, really admirable.
I mean, what I loved in the book, I mean, there's so much meat in the book. There's so much, stuff in there about her life, and many things. I mean, I've always liked Gaga as well, but I haven't really gone into looking at her life. But there were many things in there that interest me, and particularly in her youth and her early life, because a lot of that paid off later, it seems. What was her connection to music when she was a young child?
I mean, what was that was actually, I think, my favorite, the 2 chapters at the very start were, I think, my favorite to research, just because, figuring out like, how did she become Gaga and what did she actually listen to? And I mean, her, like, she had parents who were very supportive, she liked Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel and people like that. And she liked all of the 80s and 90s artists who, we all like Blondie and Garbage and bands like that. And she was just really surrounded by music, and her parents encouraged her. They saw that she was also very outgoing and also very much, was kind of a born performer, and she had music lessons. And so she was able to, start playing piano. And I mean, her parents took her to clubs. I mean, when you think about that, she had she grew up in New York City, which was so lucky in that her parents were like, okay, you're a teenager and we're going to bring you to a club and so you can play. I mean, just like really, really supportive, and just really nurtured her talent. And I mean, I think that, from a very young age, she was just surrounded by music as well, of all types. And you see how much diversity of music too. I mean, her early music was kind of, that she performed, was kind of bluesy almost. There's still tons of video, of course, on YouTube. And, it's just really, really diverse. She was really finding her voice, but she really had the space to find her voice. And just because she likes so many different kinds of music, it really helped give her ideas and helped show her what she could be as an artist.
I mean, I found it interesting that her parents weren't in any way in any creative field.
No.
And yet you use the word supportive, and there are parents that are pushy, that want their put their child on stage, and they want them to be famous in any way. But it doesn't feel from your book that they were anything else than supportive, which was quite unusual considering they weren't even in any sort of form of creative industry.
It's very true. And, when you find parents who, recognize that their children are doing something very different than they're doing, and have this talent to say, okay, we're going to go for it. We're not going to try to mold you and try to suppress that in you, is really special, I think. And they really, and she was so self-driven too. I'm thinking it's probably one of those things too, where even if they would have tried to say, maybe you should go to business school, maybe you should, get a safe degree, how about economics? She would be like, nope, this is what I want to do. I'm very stubborn, I'm very ambitious, and I'm very driven from a young age. And, they recognize that. And, for parents to let their children be who they want to be is such a powerful, special thing. And that's how we got Gaga.
I mean, what's really fascinating is that the idea that they have a piano in their flat, and that the moment she could walk and touch the keys, and then she, within a shorter period of time, she's playing by ear. So you really get the feeling of someone with an innate talent for music. And also what you say about the support and her going to acting lessons, and the feeling that the Lee Strasberg form of acting was something which was clearly going to have an impact in her later life. Can you tell me about that and what you feel that impact has been?
I mean, I think that both of those things just kind of showed her, I mean, because you're right about the innate talent. I mean, it's amazing, how many you could give a piano to 95 kids or to 100 kids, and 99 of them will just sort of plunk on it and make a lot of noise. And she managed to find, to say, oh, this makes sense to me, and pluck out melodies. She just had that kind of innate gift. I think the acting showed her, also gave her kind of that other side, because how many artists, sometimes they would rather be in the studio, or sometimes they would, they're shy. And so they'd rather be, maybe just like at home composing. The acting kind of showed her, helped her figure out how she could develop and inhabit personas. I think that's helped her down the line, because as her career has sort of evolved, it's been able to be a defense mechanism, because she obviously has the Gaga persona and then her real person. So she can put on her Gaga wear and her Gaga mask and go out in public and be one thing. But I think it's also helped her, as her art music has evolved, she's able to kind of inhabit these different characters. She can, in art pop, maybe she was one thing, and in Born This Way, she was another thing. And, it's given her more, I think, range, I guess, as a pop star as well. And the poise and ability to pull that off, because a lot of people will evolve and try on different personas and it just looks goofy or it just doesn't work. And she just really, because she was always used to going all in, she knew how to do it and she went for it.
Whenever I've interviewed artists or looking to their background, and including, I was a presenter on MTV in Europe at one point, and my background was that my father never expressed love for me. He didn't want a third child. And I think I ended up on TV. I've done loads of therapy, and I think I ended up on TV because I was looking for love from somewhere else. And when you look at artists, a lot of them have some form of childhood trauma. They have something has happened in their past, which has given them the drive. Obviously, they have to have the talent to go along with it, but that drive has, often comes from somewhere like that. But I don't see that with Gaga. How do you view it?
She talked about how, when she was, it's funny because stories vary. She's talked about being potentially bullied as a kid, and, bullied for the way she looked, because she was, very Italian and looked very different than, like she couldn't wear the styles, for example, like what a lot of girls her age were wearing, just because she looked so different. And so she talked a lot about that and how difficult that was. And, being a girl growing up in junior high and high school is difficult anyway, because girls can be so cruel to one another. And she talked about being excluded and things like that. And so there was a little bit of that, and I think that kind of shaped her because, it made her want to belong. It made her, a lot of times when people experience that, you go weirder. You basically say, nope, I'm never going to fit in. So I'm going to go to the extreme, and I'm just going to go all out. And so, you don't want to accept me, try this, and I think there was a little bit of that going on as well with her. And, when she talked about that, she dealt with a lot of, men in the music industry when she was younger, specifically, who didn't necessarily treat her the way that she should be treated. And, I think a lot of that just, showed her what she didn't want. And it showed her, I think that's why maybe she has such great control over her career, because she's like, I don't want to feel like that ever. I don't want to be in any sort of position to, where I'm not in control, where I don't have creative control. And so I think, she learned a lot of those lessons early, which I think helped. A lot of artists, it takes them a long time. And then all of a sudden one day they're like, oh no, but she learned that very, very early on because she was so sophisticated and I think precocious as well.
Has she ever talked about what triggered her interest in fashion?
It's a good question. A little bit, I think it's Bowie. I think it's a little bit of Bowie and a little bit of Andy Warhol. Because when she was kind of coming up and trying to find her voice, both of those artists were very meaningful to her. And she also had some mentors as well that, in the New York, the Lower East Side kind of, weirdo, awesome music bar community that just was really fashion was, you had to be fashionable and you had to be flamboyant and over the top to get attention. So I think a lot of that kind of formative, those formative experiences as well, I think informed her.
I mean, you mentioned the bullying, and when you talk about Bowie represented the alien, the outsider. And in a way, it's the same thing. It's the same thing that I, experienced as a teenager, that they're, being on the outside, feeling on the outside. And I think that's probably for Gaga a similar thing, that Bowie was the person that provided the world that she needed when she was younger. One thing that I find really interesting, because my original name is Stephen James, and when I became a TV presenter, I had to change it because of the union, and I chose Steve Blame. And when I went to therapy later on, the therapist said, I probably got 20 personalities, but the therapist said that as soon as you change your name, you also you invent a new personality. And that personality, you talked about the defense of being Lady Gaga. When I interviewed Madonna spoke in the third person. So I would ask Madonna a question. Sometimes she'd say, what would Madonna answer? And it fascinated me because I realized that there is this, everyone needs this form of protection. So how do you think Lady Gaga sort of is different from Stefani Germanotta?
It's funny because I feel like over her career, the two personas have kind of become closer together. I think is maybe because when she's become more established and, potentially become more comfortable in her skin. Gaga, I think is just, she is over the top and she's flamboyant and she's fearless and she's bulletproof, and she goes on stage and she is just, she is basically what Bowie was to so many people. She is the other and the beacon, reclaiming that sort of otherness to say, we all belong here. I am the patron saint. I am the mother monster of everyone who maybe doesn't feel like they fit in or doesn't, feel like they conform to society. But I think, her Stephanie Germanotta, is, she's a successful entrepreneur and she's a successful philanthropist and a businesswoman. So it's, and obviously there are elements of Gaga in there because she's very confident and she very much knows what she wants. And she knows how to talk to people to help push initiatives forward. But it's the older she gets, you can tell that there's, different elements of herself in Gaga and vice versa as well. So it's an interesting question because I feel like it also kind of like Madonna shifts by the day, depending on what she's doing. I think when she's with Tony Bennett, she's definitely a lot more Stephanie than, you see her when the way she interacts with him. It's very tender. It's kind of the way she acts toward her family and as she's been seen in documentaries. But when she's, maybe collaborating with pop musicians, she's definitely very Gaga. And so it's all very situational as well. And I think maybe she's better at navigating it now than she used to be. Because it makes sense when you're younger, you put on this persona because you're trying so hard to make it. And then once you make it, it's like, okay, I can let my guard down a little bit. People are still going to like me, even if I'm not Gaga 24/7. So it's an interesting question. It's a philosophical question almost. And I think if you ask me that in a week, my answer might change.
She's very astute with her choices, isn't she?
She is. Absolutely. Like a lot, and I know that obviously the Madonna parallel came up, during Born This Way, especially, and there's all sorts of things, but she is very, very savvy and very, very astute about her career, very savvy, but, in a way that also seems very genuine. She navigates that in a much different way than Madonna does, I think, just because she's younger. I think she's considered a millennial, and, the millennial, personality is is a lot different than maybe I think Madonna's Gen X, maybe, I don't know. So it's an interesting kind of generational shift.
I mean, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but I think possibly that Madonna was in an era where the music industry was only men.
That's true.
Do you know what I mean? So her fight as a feminist fight was in a sense much greater, and that may have hardened her along the way. And whereas Gaga has obviously been amongst that to a certain extent, but maybe had an easier, I don't know. Do you think so? It's an easier ride for her in that way?
I don't know if I don't know if anybody as a pop star has it easy at all, kind of on their road. But I think that point about Madonna is really interesting because you're right. The music industry, especially in the 70s and 80s, was extremely male dominated. And, and the fact that she was making music for teenage girls, that type of music was never respected. And so the fact that she had to work harder to get, for people to take her seriously, because she was doing dance music, her voice was unique, she had this flamboyant fashion, she was over the top, she had a lot of things stacked against her. And, and she, like Gaga, she got into acting, and I think she did get that respect eventually, but it took a while. Gaga did have kind of, Madonna paving the way. And then I think also if she came into, the 2000s, pop music was, had so many interesting women. I mean, Taylor Swift was, just starting off when Gaga came, but, she came of age and there were people like Kesha, and, she was following people like Destiny's Child and Beyonce, and, all the girl groups from the 90s and 2000s as well. And so there were definitely a lot more visible women that came right before Gaga kind of came out. And so I think that is a very plausible point. I mean,
MTV played a very important role in Madonna's life. In Gaga's life, the power of MTV waned when YouTube came up, and it also allowed video directors and artists to create what they wanted without the pressure of what was allowable on MTV. How much do you think that the videos have impacted in terms of how successful Gaga has been?
Oh, I think absolutely. And you're completely right in that, she came, she came off just as sort of, I think, like the pivot point when MTV's influence really started to wane. But every video she makes is an event. I mean, when I went back and kind of watched everything, every single video is a mini movie. And, obviously there are artists who have done that in the past, but maybe they were like, 9 minutes long. Maybe there's actual scripts. Maybe this is, inspired by Quentin Tarantino. They're all extremely well thought out and extremely tailored to each individual song. And they enhance what the song is, and they kind of not, just a storyline, but they also kind of enhance Gaga's persona. I think so many of the things and the signifiers that are in those videos are, that's what people know her for, in terms of, she was able to, maybe like going out in public, she couldn't walk in a pair of shoes because they were too high, or, maybe you don't want to wear a skin tight, bodysuit out, when you're going to LAX or something like that. But she could wear that in a video and just really kind of play with her persona even more. I mean, I think the videos are such a big part of how her music has been successful, just because she just really, I think this is also where I think where her acting came in as well, that, she was able to really kind of, morph and conform to whatever the video was going to be. I think of Telephone, which is totally a mini movie with, her and Beyonce, and, she just plays the, Bonnie and Clyde persona so well. I think that's my favorite video by her. But
yeah, that's a Jonas Åkerlund video, the same as Paparazzi.
Yep. Oh,
and
yeah.
he told me that it's a very collaborative meeting of the minds in terms of creating something for Gaga, and also how her work ethic is so incredible and absolutely phenomenal. Of course, Jonas is married to Bia Åkerlund, who is in House of Gaga. Can you tell me a little bit about what House of Gaga is?
I feel like, so she modeled it after Andy Warhol's Factory, and it's like the cauldron of creativity bubbling up around her, where it's her trusted collaborators, and that's with makeup and hairstyle and fashion, and it's sort of her brain trust that she works with and has worked with since her first record on kind of everything visual and everything, her aesthetic and how it kind of looks like, her videos, her tour staging, her artwork, her tour accessories. I mean, she has these amazing instruments, kind of like Kraftwerk made their own instruments. She took that and she ran with it like unbelievably.
So what do you think the greatest statement of her visual expression, her outfits have been? Was it the what was it, the meat one, or the bubbles, or the blood? I mean, there've been so many.
I mean, the meat one, I did a lot of research on the meat dress. It's kind of disgusting. It's amazing. God bless her for doing that, but it'll turn your stomach. I always liked the kind of the spiky, the ones that she had that were body suits that had kind of spiky armor on it. And it's funny because it's even a challenge to describe what her fashion looks like, because it's just so weird and unique. And she had the face makeup that went along with it. And she had the spiky guitars to go, or keyboards, like the guitar to go along. It looked like stalactites or something. It looked like it was in a Technicolor cave or something. I've always liked that, but I mean, she just has, I love the bubble dress too. She was really good at looking at what fashion was doing, and she was basically make a DIY version of it.
She was also influenced, wasn't she, from the 80s? I mean,
yeah.
I knew Lee Bowery in the 1980s, and obviously around in that era. And in a sense, I've always seen Lee Bowery as some sort of a symbol that she must have been influenced by, because it was always about deforming the human body in some way by the use of clothes, and making different structures out of them, and also about getting a reaction. I mean, Lee Bowery wanted a reaction when he walked down the street. So how do you see her influences?
I mean, you mentioned that there were some instances where Gaga had actual prosthetics that she would wear on her ears and face and her shoulders, like to have like little spiky shoulders almost. So she was definitely into playing kind of with the physical form and saying, I mean, and you look at like, the Grammy experience where she was in an egg and claimed that she had been in the egg for 2 days to prepare. So, I mean, it's all in performance art, but also kind of stretching the limits of what the body can do in a sense. And and some of the things she wears, like you shouldn't be able to like move in them almost. And so she was kind of playing with, what physicality could be and maybe, the limits of it too. And so it's very, I mean, I'm sure that there have been dissertations on her fashion and I would love to read those because she just has so many, and she's very subtle about where she takes influences from. It's one of those things where she might see something, it'll be an homage to something, and then you'll be like, oh yeah, okay, absolutely. And she's very savvy about that as well.
I mean, it's really funny because those things in the past that sort of connect and you go, oh yeah, the Lee Strasberg thing, the working as a go-go dancer, all those things sort of adding up and being a performance artist. Do you think she sees herself more as a performance artist or as a singer? Doesn't seem enough.
I would agree that I think performance artist fits the bill because you're right. Calling her a singer or just a musician is just kind of the start of things, just because everything is so elaborate and I mean, I was not able to see her Chromatica Ball tour, the recent stadium tour, but I mean, that was an extravaganza. Planning something like that, like it's like you're staging a production of a play or a mini movie every single night. And I definitely and the way she treats her art is so serious, and the way she plays with personas during each individual, act of her live shows, it's absolutely, I would say, a performance artist more than anything.
She's also been a massive supporter of queer rights. Yes. Can you tell me a little bit about that and why you believe that was a sort of destined thing for her to support?
I mean, part of it is, I think, when she was growing up in, the Lower East Side and, in New York City, I think that where she grew up was such a very heavily queer scene and very queer supporting. And she herself identifies as bisexual. And so I think that she's also, part of the community. But I think this all plays into also her support for people who might have been marginalized or people who might have been, said, you don't belong here. She supported same-sex marriage in the US. She was one of the most vocal supporters of that. And before the law was passed, I think it was the early 2000s. And so, she puts her money, I mean, she puts her activism where her mouth is. She doesn't give lip service and just say, oh, I support this. Like when she drove like 13 hours to perform at a rally for this. Like she definitely, she's very, very, she's very, I mean, I mentioned earlier, she was genuine. She's absolutely genuine about her advocacy. She's not the type of celebrity that's just like, I'm just going to put some money into this and call it a day. Like she definitely, you can tell, gives herself into all of that as well. And I think that just because I think she just really identifies with, I'm sure, so many of her, when you look at the music industry and the fashion industry and the makeup industry, there's so many queer artists as well. And so I think, I think she was sort of destined to do that, be supportive.
What I found very fascinating about what you wrote in the book is about her father's, well, he was a fan of Bruce Springsteen, but more than that, it was because of Bruce Springsteen's politics. And Lady Gaga is also politically active, and that came from her father's interest in Bruce Springsteen, didn't it?
It did, and it's funny because she, obviously she didn't grow up in New Jersey. I think her dad is from New Jersey, and so Bruce Springsteen is the patron saint of New Jersey. But the idea that she grew up with artists who realized, I have to take a stand for something. And, like Bruce wasn't just, going out on stage, he, another one, backed up basically his politics with his actions. And so I think that really also had a big impression on her because she realized, she grew up with these artists who, when they get a big platform, realize that what they say matters and you can make a difference. And so I think that's also really, it's like with everything, it's sort of one of the things that kind of seeped into the way she wanted to operate as well. There's a lot of ethics and integrity in the way she operates. And that's also very, very Springsteen-like, I think, in terms of, how you're kind of doing business and how you're kind of comporting yourself.
Her first two albums were immensely successful, and they also broke barriers. They were new in the themes and what they were purporting to say. Yet her third album, Art Pop, seemed a little bit of a miss. What do you think happened there, and what was her sort of mental state around that time?
It's funny because I was someone who I was not a fan of art pop at the time. I think there's even a negative review I wrote floating around. I think part of it is it was a little bit almost too forward thinking. She set the bar really high with her first two records in terms of, making pop music and electronic sort of leaning pop music. And, she really helped kind of usher in that trend with those two records. And then when she tried to go in a different direction, people weren't necessarily ready for that. And I think now it's become kind of a cult classic. Part of it is also she had some really kind of turmoil in her business life behind the scenes. I think that she had managerial changes, and I think had just been working too hard. And I think was just a little bit like burned out. And so her mental state was not the greatest at that time. It was very much, I think she's, in hindsight, she was able to see, wow, I really needed a break, and I really needed to get my brain on straight before I could really work on things. And so it was kind of a combination of everything. I'm glad that it's kind of like, Christina Aguilera's Bionic, another record that came out that everyone didn't know what to do with at the time. And in hindsight, kind of realized, wow, this was a really interesting pop record. And I think art pop is like that for Gaga as well, is that she really, she basically, she was almost too ambitious for her own good. One of the only times in her career, probably.
I mean, one thing, she worked with R. Kelly, and then she defended him at one point. But what I really appreciated about her, and I think it really is to her credit, that she apologized later on for her bad judgment. Do you think that's sort of symbolic of the type of human being that she is, that she's vulnerable, that she can make mistakes, and yet she can come out and say, yeah, sorry, I made a big mistake?
Absolutely. And I think what's so powerful about that is when, she's such a strong persona, and she's, comes across as, I'm totally confident. But there's also so much power in being able to say, I was wrong. I messed up. I shouldn't have done this. And that can be hard to navigate a lot of times, because when you are a strong person, you don't necessarily think you can say that and be that vulnerable. And the fact that she was able to come out and did later say, this was a total mistake. I should not have supported him. Like, I do not support him at all. And, she was not the only one in the music industry who at the time worked with him. And, it took a long time for the music industry to be like, wow, no, this is not okay. And to be able to come out and say, this is not okay, anything he's done. But she said, no, I screwed up. And, I think it makes total sense that she would say that, because it goes back to her kind of principles and integrity, because, she knows she's smart enough. She would be like, I would be a hypocrite if I basically didn't come out and say and speak out against this, because of everything it goes against for everything she stands for, and everything that she's, promoted, and everything that she's, said matters to her. And it took a little bit of a while, but again, like so many in the music industry, that she was not alone in that. And I think that it's important that the fact she did get there, and she did say, I messed up, and I will do better in the future. And I think that is very powerful.
And she's definitely a risk taker. I mean, working with Tony Bennett wasn't as, he'd worked with other artists before Lady Gaga, but it wasn't necessarily a sort of clear choice of like, this will be successful in any way. And also going into the movies, if you look at the history of pop stars who have acted, it's not always that positive. So what is it about her, and well, first of all, this Tony Bennett thing, why do you think this risk came off?
I mean, I think part of the risk came off, I think, because she's such a versatile talent. I think, the fact that she, could do, I mean, it just speaks to how, eclectic she is, because you're right. How many artists could do like a jazz record or do a standards record? And you're like, boy, this is really self-indulgent. She went for it. But she met Tony where he was. And, you know, and just really, because I think also her classical training, I think also gave her an edge as well. And the fact that she's done theater and done acting, it made a lot of sense that the songs they were doing as well. And so I think she is just that versatile of an artist. I think also she was just really, you know, she was all in. It wasn't like she didn't act like she was just dabbling in a side project. You know, when she was working with Tony Bennett, she was like, okay, everything else is to the side. This is my focus. And I think that's another big difference too, is that when she is working on something, whether it's acting in a movie or, you know, doing project or, you know, an album, that is her focus. She is not necessarily dividing her time. She's not trying to, you know, be something she's not. Like, she's really, her full attention is there. And I think that that's why I think there's so much, you know, and that attention to detail, you can tell when you look at everything that comes off is just, you know, it might not be creatively successful, but it sounds flawless. You know, she's not necessarily making things that sound subpar. She's making sure everything she puts out is of high quality, you know, whether you like it or not, whether it's successful or not, you know, that's sort of for the market and fans to kind of figure out. But I mean, she just gives her all, and you can tell. And, you know, and like I said, the way she interacts with Tony is so tender and so just so respectful and reverent as well. You know, and he has said, you know, glowing things about her, but, you know, she kind of returns the favor, and she's very much is honored to be working with him. And that also really shows as well. And it's fun. I mean, I guess you can't even say that. She has so much fun when you watch them on stage. She's having fun kind of taking a break from being an over-the-top pop star, and she's wearing a glamorous dress and playing in beautiful theaters and doing something new. Like, that's amazing. That's awesome.
I mean, in terms of acting in the films, one thing that is I think it's very difficult when you are known for one thing, you know, as a pop star with a particular image. It's very difficult because at first, as a viewer, when you're watching a film and someone like Lady Gaga is in that film, the first image you have is in your head of who Lady Gaga is in your head and not on that screen. So she has to fight even more to win the audience over, doesn't she?
She really does. And I think that's why when you look at her turn in A Star Is Born, it's even more remarkable, because, you know, you know that she's Gaga because, you know, she has a very distinctive look, but she just inhabited the persona of the star, you know, trying to make things happen. You know, she just, you know, what the best actors and actresses, I think, you know, when they're playing challenging roles, they kind of disappear into the role and disappear into the persona. She really did that. And, you know, I think part of it's probably because, you know, a lot of the source material was probably very familiar to her, because she was, you know, she had probably went through very similar things as she was trying to come up as an artist. But, you know, she just took it in such a different, intense direction, you know. And I know she's had other film roles as well, but I mean, that just stood out to me, that I was like, wow, she was incredible in that movie.
Yeah, you really felt that she knew it, but she was incredible in House of Gucci. I really thought her performance was amazing in that. So she's very multifaceted. Okay, she's a performer, she's an actress, she's a leader in terms of pop culture, and she's done so many things. But what do you believe will be the lasting cultural significance of Lady Gaga?
That's such a big question. I mean, I think she's sort of redefined what a pop star could be. I mean, when you look at, you know, pop music right now is in such kind of a maximalist era where, you know, you look at Taylor Swift, you know, just released a record, and there are, you know, 20 some different formats. I mean, it's very much like it's an event. You know, pop music is an event. And Gaga was one of the first, you know, modern pop artists to really, you know, introduce eras, I guess you might say, that every album she put out has a different sort of look and a different aesthetic and a different sort of universe that it's inhabiting. And she was really good at doing that. And I think now it's expected for pop musicians to do that. You can't just put out a pop record and say, okay, here it is. There has to be a story around it, a narrative. There has to be a 360-degree visual aesthetic around it. And, you know, Gaga was really, really good at that. You know, I think her other legacy is just going to be versatility, and that the fact that you don't have to just be limited by pop music. You know, I think I just saw yesterday she's in the studio working with a jazz pianist. So, she's working on something else as well. Pop music can be a starting point. I think, she really kind of showed people that you don't have to be in a narrow box. You can do one thing and you can make pop music your own. You can kind of make it whatever you want it to be. And I think we've seen that time and time again in the last, decade and a half since she's kind of emerged, that she's just really, she just really kind of paved the way. And like you mentioned earlier, the vulnerability, you can be this kind of bulletproof person and you can be confident, but you can also be yourself, and you can also be, a little, let a little bit more of emotion in, and let a little bit more, say, be a little tender, maybe be a little soft at sometimes. So it's a little bit more diverse and eclectic in terms of just your emotionality. And so I think that that's one of the major things that she's done as well.
Do you think she can achieve the same status? This is a difficult question because A, she's still going. So this is a really hard one to ask. But do you think she can achieve the same status as her own heroes, as Bowie, as Freddie Mercury, all those people in the past that have such a massive status? It's a different generation, so it's a generational thing as well. But do you think that is possible, that we will think of Gaga in the future? I won't be around, but we will think of Gaga in the future in the same way as my generation thinks about, Freddie Mercury and David Bowie, and your generation thinks about Michael Stipe and all the people you loved when you were young.
I mean, it is a big question. I think, because you're right, it's the music industry is so different now, because I think when Bowie came out and when Queen came out, I mean, there were so many fewer musicians, when you think about it, bands, there wasn't necessarily as much competition. Gaga, has, even though she's very singular, there's so many pop artists that take up your attention. So I think she will be remembered in that kind of that upper echelon. But I'm not sure if it'll be as kind of, I don't necessarily know if we're going to be having T-shirts with her visage like we do with Bowie, or I mean, I have Bowie Barbie dolls, I mean, it's because I love Bowie too. And that it's almost like Bowie has transcended his music, and he's kind of like Kurt Cobain is, and some of these artists, he's an icon of his own thing. And I'm not sure if she'd ever get there, but that's not a knock on her talent, just because she is just, she's doing her own thing and carving her own way. And so maybe in 25 years, there'll be a new kind of icon that we haven't even thought of yet. And that'll be her. It's so hard to say. But I think she is one of those artists that's really, she's one of the artists that like your parents know, and and your kids know. She's definitely spanned different generations. She's one of those pop stars that people of all ages can like, even though she is very over the top and flamboyant. And I think that's a real sign, just in terms of, cultural ubiquity, that when you do sort of, everyone knows who you are.
So in the end, Annie Zaleski, I want to just congratulate you on the book, Lady Gaga Applause, and say it's really like some form of surgical look, with so many interesting facts and information that you've gathered from other sources, and being able to put together in a really easy way to read and follow. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. So congratulations on bringing something out into the world of pop culture that is, I always feel it's very important. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for the nice words. I really, you write something and you never know, you're like, okay, it's out there now. Oh no, and so I thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And that means a lot.